I am an associate professor and director of clinical and research operations at Center for Autism and the Developing Brain at Weill Cornell. Steve Kenny usually leads this group, but he's out of town today. So I was asked to lead the group. We are so fortunate to have Stephanie Weber, Lisa Wiggins, and Jennifer Zubler here. They are going to share their recent work with CDC. The title of the topic is Parent Engaged Developmental Monitoring using CDC's Development Milestone Checklist. They're going to give us an overview of the revisions and the update. If you guys have questions, feel free to put the questions in the chat, and we can go over those questions at the end. I'll have Jen, Steph, and Lisa introduce themselves. So go ahead, you guys.
Great. Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and share the slides. And again, you can see those well?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for having us. We're excited to be here to talk about the wonderful work of the Learn the Signs Act Early and Parent Engaged Developmental Monitoring. I'm Stephanie Weber. I'm a clinical psychologist at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and I'm here with Dr. Wiggins and Dr. Zubler. Just briefly, I am the CDC's Learn the Signs Act Early Ambassador to Ohio and the PI for our COVID-19 grant in our state. Dr. Wiggins is a developmental psychologist and behavioral scientist at CDC, and the findings and conclusions in our presentation are those of our authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the CDC. And Dr. Zubler's disclosures is that she's a contractor and consultant for the CDC's Learn the Signs Act Early program. Overall, today we wanted to talk about the ideas around developmental delays and disabilities not being identified early enough, as we're all very keenly aware. Talking about the Learn the Signs Act Early programs revisions that have been made in about mid-February to really support that communication for families and monitoring their child's development. We want to talk about promotion of parent engaged developmental monitoring, and particularly what that means, and how to support developmental surveillance at well child visits with healthcare teams, as well as just in general, improving the awareness of the systems around early identification of delays and disabilities. So many children are not identified with developmental disabilities before they start kindergarten, which obviously means they may miss out on those early intervention services when their brains are rapidly developing, and intervention services are more likely to have the biggest impact for them. So we know that 1 in 4 children under the age of 5 are at moderate to high risk for developmental, behavioral, or social emotional delays, and that 1 in 6, 3 to 17, have an identified developmental disability. And as you are all very aware, recent statistics out of the CDC's ADAM network say that 1 in 44 children have autism spectrum disorder. So what we know is that evidence shows that we're starting to support that supports as early as possible is best. We all know that early intervention is the best case scenario for so many children. And the earlier we get them identified, the sooner the targeted interventions and family supports can start. And we want to say that it's never too late to start services. I know in some states, early intervention Part C may have a specific time that they'd like for children to be referred in, but never are services started too late. Any time can be a great time to start those. Intervention can obviously improve skills, abilities, definitely future school performance, long-term adaptive and self-care skills, and just overall quality of life for the child and the family. We know that other benefits of early identification and targeted interventions increase a family's understanding of their child's strengths and the need areas, and it really improves family wellness. And because when families recognize that their child may not be meeting the milestones as expected or are behaving differently than what other children may be behaving like, they may second guess their parenting abilities, misinterpret child's behavior as not listening or purposefully behaving in a difficult manner. So it can be really helpful for families to understand and learn as early as possible that the child may be developing differently and just may need additional supports. Like breaking directions down into smaller steps or extra time to do an activity. So understanding the child's strengths and areas for support may really strengthen the family and protect against child abuse and neglect as well. When we think about early identification and intervention, and with so many children being at risk for developmental delays and disabilities, we know we have to start with surveillance. And the recommendations are to identify children when they have the most rapid brain development in those first 3 years. And to do this, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that developmental surveillance, also called monitoring, should be done at all health supervision visits. So every well child visit. Parents, early childhood educators, or other early childhood professionals, anyone in the young child's can all monitor child development and refer those children with concerns to their healthcare provider for developmental screening, for ongoing discussion of those concerns, or, and in all states, they can be referred directly to the early intervention program. Oftentimes we encourage a both approach. So refer on for more discussion with the health provider and refer to the state's early intervention services. In that healthcare setting, it's recommended that all children receive regular universal developmental screening at 9, 18, and 30 months. And then the autism specific screenings occur at 18 and 24 months. And then developmental surveillance or monitoring is recommended at every well child visit, like we said. And if there are any concerns at any point brought up by someone in the child's life during those surveillance visits, it's recommended that the child receive developmental screening in addition to the 9, 18, and 30 months, or the autism screening at 18 and 24 months. And also an early return visit for further developmental surveillance. Let's see, what other points do we have? We all know that we work with a lot of different teams, and the early childhood professionals, such as home visitors, WIC programs, early education centers, and many others can monitor and perform developmental screening. Families and caregivers are really important members of that team. So we always want to make sure that their ideas are heard and supported and really empower families. We know that oftentimes families don't speak up because what the doctor says goes in their culture. And so we really want to use the materials that we'll discuss today to help empower them to use them as communication tools with their providers. Typically, children will qualify for their state early intervention program based on their level of developmental delay, and that varies by state. So some children automatically qualify based on their condition, and some children have to be evaluated. Typically, a child does not need to receive a diagnosis to receive early intervention. So it's recommended that concerns for delays and disabilities based on those screening results, or because of a concern has arose, despite screening. So even if there isn't a positive screen, but families are concerned, we want to refer them to determine if they're eligible for the state early intervention program. And often children are simultaneously referred, like I said, for early intervention and diagnostic evaluations. And this is ideal situation. So they can start receiving any services that they qualify for while maybe waiting for those diagnostic evaluations that many of you all are doing. It's important to note that the process for developmental surveillance and monitoring is ongoing and longitudinal. And so even if a child has an identified developmental delay, the progress and development in other domains should be closely monitored as well. So if there are concerns or developmental screening or evaluations do not result in qualifying for services, then additional community services and resources should be explored with the family. And we really just want to provide families the tips and activities to promote child development. And that's really what we'll talk about a lot today with the materials. And so with that, I will move on to the next slide. So just as a review, many of you all know this very well, but surveillance is just is also known as monitoring, and it's one part of the picture here. And then it occurs at every well child visit, uses the developmental milestones, incorporates family and all the people that are monitoring. It's ongoing. There's no scores, there's no structured protocols, but it can support the need for the developmental screening, which is administered by early childhood professionals at specific ages and using materials that are standardized and validated. And so it also, screening would provide the risk categories and the scores, but it's not diagnostic. So we all know that we see some children come through our doors that have a positive screen on an MCHAT, and that's how they get to us in developmental behavioral pediatrics evaluations. But also the screening could be used to qualify a child for early intervention programs. So if you're not familiar with your state's Part C early intervention qualifications, it would be a great time to check into that. So where does CDC's Learn the Signs Act Early program, milestone checklists, and other resources fit into this early identification process for young children? Since 2005, this program has provided free resources to families, healthcare providers, early childhood professionals, WIC, home visiting, and more to support the early identification. The checklists were developed to be family friendly, and 2 publications from the AAP help support developmental monitoring and surveillance. These materials are not to be used for developmental screening or to replace developmental screening. I think that's really important and a misconception that some are currently having in the communities that we serve. So they're not standards or guidelines, but they are communication tools that aim to promote developmental monitoring and encourage those really rich conversations between the parents and the child's doctor and any early childhood professionals in the child's life. The checklists come in multiple formats. There's printable PDFs that can be used at the health surveillance visits. There's online digital versions of the checklists that families can use online or print out. I love the Milestone Tracker app. It has all the checklists as well as a brief summary that can be emailed directly to the child's health provider. And it also has tips and tricks to really kind of help promote development. And then the Milestone Moments booklets here on the right are fantastic because they are so much of the information that's in the app, but in a nice small booklet that can be put in a diaper bag or a backpack. And for those families that prefer the paper formats over electronic, this is an ongoing record of developmental progress. So developmental monitoring, again, is just one part of the early identification process, and it adds different information than screening alone. And it's really supposed to be a protective factor. And when we think about the strengthening families, one of those factors is parent understanding and knowledge about child development. And that's what this is all intended to do. We really want to build those those trusting relationships with families and promote development. And so all of these materials are, again, there for that purpose. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wiggins to talk about the new milestones and what you may have been hearing.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. That was really a wonderful introduction to the milestone checklist. So I just wanted to start off by reiterating some points that Stephanie made about the checklist and their purpose, and that, really they are not screening tools. They are one part of the early identification process. And that process starts with developmental surveillance or developmental monitoring, and then can move on to screening, evaluation, and then treatment if needed. So these are really tools that can help empower families and provide a starting point for providers and other professionals to have a conversation about child development, what is expected at particular ages, how parents can support their child's growth, and then also offering reminders for when routine developmental screening should occur. So these tools do not replace developmental screening, but they can be an important first step to facilitate developmental screening. These do not represent CDC guidance, although that they are extremely important in helping to enhance that parent and provider relationship. And we did start this process many years ago. This is not something that that occurred overnight. We started the process in 2019, and then the publication was in 2022. Okay, we can move forward. So why did we revise the milestones? First of all, as Stephanie mentioned, these were developed in 2005, and we felt that it was time to re-review the milestones from a comprehensive viewpoint to see if any revisions could be made, especially in response to some of the feedback that we had received from parents and providers. And some of the feedback was that there was room for improvement with the current milestones, One area of improvement was that we didn't have a checklist for the 15 and 30-month health supervision visits. So we wanted to make sure that the checklist did cover all ages at which children would be touching point with their pediatricians and other providers. So we wanted to add those particular ages to our compilation of materials. We also received feedback from parents and professionals that some of the milestones were vague, and then so they were difficult to interpret. So some of the milestones started with your child may be doing such and such, or beginning to speak in 2-word sentences. And that was confusing to a lot of parents. And then there were these warning signs or red flags. And again, it was confusing to parents and professionals about when should they be concerned. Some of these milestones that were on the checklist represented what half of children would be able to do by a certain age, or 50, the 50th percentile. And then others were truly milestones that were what most children can do. So there was a combination of those, and it was confusing to parents and professionals about when they should be concerned that a child may not be meeting a milestone and should therefore move forward with screening or with a more in-depth evaluation. Okay, so if we move forward. So all of these points of feedback really indicated that some of the milestones that were on the old checklist were causing a lot of stress or worry for parents, because they didn't know if their child was meeting the milestones at expected ages. They didn't know if this represented something that would be a red flag or cause concern or should facilitate a conversation. And so a lot of parents were saying that they were hesitant to begin a conversation with their provider because the milestones that were represented, the purpose of them were not completely clear. So we wanted to eliminate all of that worry. And then we also wanted to add the 15 and 30-month checklist, but also one of the things that guided us in this process was that we wanted the milestones to be evidence informed. And what that means is that we wanted to draw from the current literature to see what the research said in terms of the age at which most children would be expected to achieve a particular milestone. And we knew going into this process that there's not a lot of published data that gives you that type of specific information for individual milestones at specific ages. But we wanted to do our best to find the data that was out there and to use that to guide our decisions. But we also wanted to look at what is available from current screening and diagnostic tools, as well as published clinical opinion. And that's based on experience or from opinions that have been handed down over the ages, but may not have a lot of research backing or research support. And doing that literature review and going through that process, we wanted to focus on, again, what most children would be able to do. And we chose about 75% of the children. This does not mean that the new revised milestone checklist is a 75th percentile, that every single one of them. We use that as our framework. But of course, with the limited information available, there were times where we saw a milestone at the 50th percentile in one publication and the 90th percentile in another publication. And so we got together as a group and made a consensus on where we felt that milestone would be most appropriate to put in terms of the individual checklist for the ages. Okay, move forward. So we wanted to make sure that the process that we used was standardized so that it would be very clear. The methods that we used were very clear and could be replicated by other groups. We did partner with the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AAP, in this effort. So this is a joint enterprise between AAP and CDC, and we both have co-branded the new materials. And our first step was to recruit developmental experts to engage in this process. And AAP recruited 8 developmental experts who had experience in a wide variety of different areas. Most of them were either pediatricians or child psychologists. We did have one who was trained in speech language pathology, one who was a professor of special education and early intervention. And then we had one who was a developer of a developmental screening tools. And then a couple of the professionals had previously been a part of writing developmental guidelines and recommendations. So, and of course, we had a CDC Learn the Signs Act Early ambassador and then a parent representative. Okay, so after we recruited the experts, we got together and we wanted to develop criteria that the milestones would have to meet in order to be considered for placement on a particular checklist. And these are the 11 criteria that we came up with. I won't read them out for you. They are listed in the paper, but I do just want to highlight a couple of them. Again, we wanted to focus on milestones that most children, and we use most roughly, it's about 70, the 75th percentile would be expected to achieve by a particular age. We wanted to make sure that these milestones were easy for families to observe and report on, and that they were appropriate for families of different social, cultural, and ethnic backgrounds, that they could be answered with yes, no, or not sure, included open-ended questions, and then also showed developmental progression from one age to more advanced ages or older ages. Okay. So why 75th percentile? We've gotten this question a few times since the publication. And again, we wanted to reiterate that most of the publications out there are focusing on mean ages, average ages, or 50th percentiles. And those are really great for training pediatricians and other healthcare professionals because they provide a basis for typical development, but they don't really provide any guidance on when someone should be concerned and initiate a conversation about their child's development. So we wanted to make sure that the milestones that were on each of these checklists, that if a parent looked at them and said, my child has not mastered that particular skill, that they know that that should prompt a conversation with their provider. So we focused on the 75th percentile. We didn't want to go higher than the 75th percentile, like the 80th or 90th, because we did want to, provide a little leeway so that children could still be referred and be treated for delays before they became that severe or that impactful at the 80th or 90th percentile. And so with the 75th percentile criteria, we felt that this was an appropriate way in which we could catch children without causing unnecessary concern and with eliminating all of the confusion of when do I actually have a conversation with my healthcare provider. Okay. So in evaluating most, we engaged I said earlier that we wanted to make sure we engaged in a standardized process where the methods were clear and that other people could replicate. And that basically involved several different stages. And one of those stages was conducting a thorough literature review of research that contained normative data. And normative data is data that gives you those percentiles based on a population that serves as a baseline for reference or a baseline for comparison. So we actually had the CDC library help us out with this literature review. The co-authors came up with keywords, key phrases that would be included in the literature review, and the CDC librarian actually conducted the review. And then we would supplement if there was something that was not clear in our discussions. We would see if we could find any additional information in the literature that did not come up in the literature review. So from that process, we found only 34 articles that had normative data, or 34 articles that we reviewed. 24 of those had normative data and 10 had published clinical opinion. And after we reviewed that information, we used the information that was published in technical manuals of common screening and evaluation tools, as well as those public clinical opinion pieces. And we used all of that information to help guide our discussions as a work group. And we would review each of the developmental milestones, see which evidence was available. And then based on the evidence that was available, we would decide on a particular age checklist for that milestone to fall. All of our decisions were reached by consensus. So everyone in the expert work group agreed. And then the Learn the Signs Act Early program took the group of milestones and the ages that we recommended. They did cognitive testing with parents, made sure that the milestones were at a 5th to 7th grade reading level and were family friendly. And with the cognitive testing, we did test these new milestones on both English and Spanish speaking families. Okay, and these are just some of the additional sources that we reviewed, in addition to the articles that were produced from the literature review. So you can see there are a lot of parent resources that many parents and professionals rely on. Most of these, again, represent 50th percentiles. So the AAP Bright Futures, ASHA's developmental charts, our old checklist, the First Words Project checklist. We had screening tools like the Ages and Stages questionnaire, the MChat, the PEDS, and then some of the common diagnostic tools like the Bailey and the Wiggins and the Caputi and the Mullen. Okay, so some of the biggest challenges that we faced in this process was, normative data is really difficult to find, and that's unfortunate. And it's one of the goals of this project, and one of our goals of the paper was to really say, we need some more supporting research on when these milestones are expected to emerge in large populations of culturally diverse children. So we're hoping that this will inspire research that can further inform future revisions, not only to CDC milestone checklists, but to other milestone checklists or ways in which we can help facilitate developmental monitoring. Resources usually are not cited. So there will be published clinical opinions about when milestones are expected to occur, but there's no citation involved. So it's difficult to go back and track where those opinions initially stemmed. And a lot of times if a citation is provided, it's a repetition of another clinical opinion. And so you really can't trace it back to any normative data or population-based research. A lot of the screeners and psychometric tests are based on, again, unpublished normative data. And then when the normative data does exist, it doesn't fit very nicely into the categories that we want them to. So it doesn't say 75th percentile at 6 months versus 12 months versus 18 months. So that's where a lot of our discussions had to come up as, what percentiles were reported at what ages, and how can we use that information to guide our decisions? Okay. All right, so I believe now I am going to hand it over to Jen for the next part of the presentation.
Great. Thank you, and thank you, Lisa, for sharing the process of the revisions, and Stephanie for giving some background on where the Learn the Signs Act early checklists fit into the early identification process. This is just a table, an example of some of the tables that are in the paper that you can look at that just shows, whether the milestone is an old milestone, a new milestone, and what type of data was looked at to support that milestone. Next slide. And so there were other criteria, as Lisa mentioned earlier, besides normative data. So I just want to restate that there were things that were considered important when developing or revising a health communication tool for families to use, because they are the real users of the materials. And so after normative data was looked at, the milestones were also reviewed in light of the other criteria to be family friendly, written at a 5th to 7th grade reading level. And then cognitive testing was done with families, with English and Spanish speaking families from diverse backgrounds after the milestones initial list was developed. And cognitive testing is something, I'm a pediatrician, I found very fascinating because families were asked who had children in the age of the checklist to fill out the checklist. And then they were asked questions like, what did you think about when you were answering that milestone? What did you picture? What did you remember? How did you answer it? How would you ask another family about that milestone? And then also things like, did you find the milestone offensive in any way? So next slide. And the results of the process are listed here. And so there was a 26% reduction in the total number of milestones. So we went from 216 milestones to 159 milestones spread over 12 well-child visit checklists. And so we went from an average of 23 milestones per checklist to 13. 60% of the milestones were the original CDC milestones. 2/3 of those original CDC milestones stayed right where they originally were. 1/3 did move, oftentimes to an older age. And then 40% of the milestones were replaced with new milestones. As Lisa mentioned, we used different types of sources for data to support the milestone, and 80% of the milestones had normative data from at least one source. And then we did find it difficult, more difficult than the other milestones, to find social, emotional, and cognitive milestones. And I do want to mention that even though many of the original CDC milestones are still there, they sometimes were reworded based on review of the language used to make sure they weren't confusing for families, and sometimes based on the feedback that we had gotten from the cognitive testing from families. So for instance, the old milestone says several single words is now tries to say 3 or more words besides mama or dada. The use of the word several was eliminated, and besides mama and dada were added to improve clarity for parents. And even though there was not normative data for all the milestones, there was, as Lisa mentioned, screening, published a clinical opinion, and the consensus of the developmental expert group. Next slide, please. So what about crawling and talking? These are things that you may have heard about if you've been following the revisions of the CDC. And so listed here are just some important points to know about milestones. So as I mentioned, there are 159 milestones. And the process and evidence used to inform which milestones and what age to place them in was published to encourage further research in milestones used for surveillance and dialogue on the best practices in developmental monitoring and surveillance. So it's not surprising that there will not be agreement across all of the 159 milestones. But this can help us all move forward to continue to improve resources for families and early childhood professionals. But it's important to note that achievement of an individual milestone when used in surveillance does not mean a child is developing typically, nor does lack of a single milestone. So just to touch base a little bit about crawling in particular, there was little normative data available. And the definition of crawling that's associated with some of the normative data varied. And so do you mean crawling on all fours, or do you mean scooting across the floor on your bottom? And the evidence reported that not all typically developing children crawl, nor was there a set pattern to when children crawl in relationship to pre-walking skills. And for concerns about expressive language by 30 months, keep in mind that there are communication milestones on all the CDC checklists for ongoing monitoring. And in terms of expressive language, the checklists demonstrate a child's progression from using mama and dada at 12 months to a few words besides mama and dada at 15 months, and to 3 or more words besides mama and dada at 18 months, using 2 words together at 24 months, and using 2 words together with 1 action word at 30 months, and talking in conversation with at least 2 and back and forth exchanges at 36 months. So in regards to the 50 words, approximately 50 words at 30-month milestone, the experts, including a speech-language pathologist, agreed at the time that despite variability reported in the literature, most children would be expected to have 50 words by 30 months of age. And if not, this would be something to act on. It's not intended for families or providers to count number of words, but instead to have a sense of quantity of words. When testing for understanding with the parents during the cognitive testing with English and Spanish-speaking parents, parents did not have difficulty answering or understanding this milestone. Parents described the milestone as asking whether a child has a few words or a lot of words. For example, one parent reported her child does not say many words, so I did not check it. Meaning she didn't check off that milestone, which is exactly what we want to have happen. And also, in regards to this milestone, in particular, the 50 words, it appears at an age when universal developmental screening is recommended. So a child coming in for a well child visit or an early child educator encouraging a family to go for a well child visit should also be receiving universal developmental screening when they go to that 30-month visit. And then the autism-specific screening should have been done at 24 months of age. So while focusing on the bigger picture of developmental surveillance and screening and discussing individual milestones in the context of developmental surveillance on the CDC communication tools, we do want to investigate and learn more about people's concerns for individual milestones. So this has been a really great opportunity for all of us to learn more about milestones and their roles, and we look forward to exploring concerns further. Just as in the past, families and professionals' feedback will be collected and considered for potential future revisions, and the team will review all comments received along with any newly published evidence on a regular basis. Next slide. All these discussions have led us to make sure that we do a better job of explaining how milestones are used differently. So CDC milestones, as you've heard, fit into the early identification process at the earliest step of contemplation of any developmental concerns as part of an awareness effort in the context of a health communications tool. As you've heard, CDC milestones are not standards or guidelines. They do not change any tools used for screening, evaluation for services, or diagnosis. And we knew there was always some confusion about milestones used for monitoring and surveillance versus screening, and we have spent a lot of effort over the years making sure people understand the difference between monitoring and surveillance and screening. But now we're aware that we need to spend a little more time clarifying some of the misinformation about whether or not these CDC revised milestones for developmental surveillance impact screening or diagnosis. And so as you can see, there are differences, and I know many of you do this work, and so you're aware there are significant differences between how milestones are used at different processes or different steps along the early identification process. So Learn the Signs Act Early is strengthening old relationships, but we're also forging new ones and look forward to working with partners throughout the early identification process, including those who are at the referral end and are more likely to be using screening and diagnostic tools. Next slide. And this is where you can find the paper. We're grateful to Pediatrics for making it open access. Next slide. And so this is my favorite part as a pediatrician, is I get to talk about the additional features of the checklist. And they're not just perks, they really are important because they can really help support the early identification process. So the revised milestones are just one component of the milestone checklist. And so now I just want to delve a little bit deeper into some of those other features that are really important. Next slide. So the open-ended questions, they were added, so this is the first time we have these, to the CDC's surveillance tools because they give additional information about the child's development. And they allow families, early childhood professionals, and healthcare providers to use a strength-based approach during developmental conversations. And these questions are just a beginning, just a foundation, and they can be expanded upon during conversations with families. The first question really kind of sets the stage for strength-based discussions. The second question, what does your child like to do, can also help with those strength-based discussions, but it can also serve as a developmental question. Early childhood providers may learn about concerning behaviors that parents may not recognize or be concerned about when you're reviewing this question. So for example, if a parent is describing their child as being very independent and liking to play by themselves, that could warrant further discussion about the child's social emotional development. The third question, is there anything your child does or does not do that concerns you, can help capture information a milestone checklist alone cannot. On average, there are only 13 milestones per checklist to stimulate thought and discussion of how a child is developmentally progressing. Milestone checklists cannot encompass everything. So some developmental information is difficult to capture through milestones alone. For example, the quality of how a child does something might be of concern. And we know from interviews with parents of children with muscular dystrophies that their children were walking, but they had concerns about how their child was walking. These parents did not feel milestones would capture their concerns and suggested this type of question. The final question is a reminder to families and early childhood professionals that some children are at greater risk for developmental delays and disabilities and may need more frequent developmental screening. Of course, these are not the only risk factors and can be expanded upon, but it's just a trigger to remind the early childhood professionals, including healthcare providers, that we need to consider other things when looking at an individual child, such as family history of developmental delays, certain medical conditions, social drivers of health, and more. So these questions are to trigger discussion and further questions and support discussions of strengths, risks, and protective factors a child may have. And then they also can encourage parents to share any other concerns they may have about their child's development, regardless of whether or not they are meeting milestones. Next slide, please. If you've used the Learn the Signs Act early materials before, you may have noticed that there were milestones in a special call-out box that professionals oftentimes call red flags. They were not called that for families for obvious reasons, but they were when to act early milestones. And over the years, the program received feedback from families and early childhood professionals that having two lists of milestones in one tool made it difficult to know when to be concerned and when it was appropriate to take action on a possible concern. Many of the when to act early milestones were simply milestones repeated from an earlier age. Using milestones most children would be expected to achieve allowed incorporation of 77% of those warning sign milestones into the revised checklist. This simplifies things to one list of milestones to take action on. Those that were not incorporated may be better recognized during the child's well visit, such as stiff or tight muscles. Or they may be better captured in the new open-ended question I just mentioned. Is there anything your child is doing or is not doing that concerns you? I do have to say that question is one of my favorites, and one of the parents who was doing the cognitive testing mentioned, yeah, there's all those milestones, but this question is really about my child. And so I think it's an important question. It's one question, but I think it really can help support families. So all the revised milestones are now considered red flags or ones to act early on by discussing them and considering and administering developmental screening if a child is missing any of these milestones. The developmental experts who participated in the revision process agreed that a child not meeting even one of the new milestones should be considered for developmental screening, just as children demonstrating the previously designated warning signs would have been considered for developmental screening, because the new milestones represent those that most children their age would be expected to achieve. I do want to emphasize that if families, early child educators, or other professionals have concerns regardless of milestones, it's also recommended that developmental screening be done, since families and those involved in regular care of the child know that child best. Next slide, please. So this is a sample of the top of the 18-month checklist. And again, the checklists do not replace developmental screening at the recommended visit ages, but do support it by reminding parents and providers the ages that universal developmental screening is due. Further discussion of development may support additional formal screening at any other well child visit too, not just the recommended ages. The Milestone Tracker app gives additional parent reminders when child visits are due and when to expect developmental screening. The print materials, like the one here, state which well visits parents can expect routine developmental screening to occur. These reminders can encourage families to attend well child visits, think about their child's development, complete a milestone checklist, and be prepared to complete developmental screening tools. Using the CDC's milestone checklist for developmental monitoring and surveillance at each health supervision visit can help parents prepare for later developmental screening and recognize that discussion of their child's development is part of routine health supervision. Next slide, please. Okay, these are mine and many others on this call's favorite thing, the parent tips and activities. So the revision process was also an opportunity to revise and expand the parent tips and activities to provide practical ways for parents to support their child's development, what professionals call developmental promotion. The CDC's Child Development Studies team, positive parenting tips were used in the past and continue to be the foundation of the parent tips and activities. The CDC's Learn the Signs Act Early team led this revision process separately from the Milestone revision process. An early child educator helped revise the tips along with a team of CDC experts in speech-language pathology, health communication, child development, safety, nutrition, and more. These tips are consistent with advice early childhood professionals and healthcare providers already give family. Some new topics, updates, and expansion to the tips include social, emotional, and relational health tips, responsive parenting and feeding, self-care, and screen time. I do want to point out that some milestones that were removed because they did not meet the new criteria were adapted into tips for developmental promotion, since they provide valuable information for families. So there are tips to encourage crawling or scooting across the floor, and there are many tips to promote communication. The aim of the tips is to strengthen families by offering free, equitable access to sound parenting information and developmental promotion that may not be readily available to all families. Next slide. So I'll speed things up a little bit because I know we have some more to get through. And here are some of the strengths we've talked about with the CDC Milestone Checklist tools. And next slide. And the available evidence suggests that the developmental experts selected milestones that are most children, including those from diverse racial and cultural backgrounds, would exhibit. More than half the literature used to inform the revisions to the milestone was based on international studies from non-English speaking countries. 2 native Spanish-speaking pediatricians reviewed the translations of the CDC milestones, and CDC's multilingual services certified the translation process. Efforts were made to select milestones that families and caregivers could observe in a child's natural settings, their home, preschool, and out and about in the community. And they were written again using patient-friendly language that was tested with families and written at a 5th to 7th grade reading level. Next slide, please. So there are limitations to the checklist, and they're listed here, and they're very prominent in the paper. As with any tools early childhood professionals use, it's important to know both the strengths and limitations of the resources we're using. CDC surveillance tools are not developmental screeners, as you've heard, or pre-screeners. They're to support developmental monitoring and surveillance. They are not validated. Screening tools are validated, not surveillance tools like the Learn the Signs Act Early checklist. And the milestone checklists are not inclusive of all potential milestones children may exhibit at a given age. Surveillance involves more than the use of milestones. It includes discussing a child's development, eliciting parents' concerns, educating families about typical development, developmental promotion, and then for healthcare providers, observing the child and examining the child during the health supervision visit, and for early childhood professionals, doing the same in their own settings. If you're interested in using the checklist in any research, you can freely use the CDC checklist, but we'd love to know about it and know about any research that you're planning. And you can contact CDC's Learn the Signs Act Early program at the email that's listed there in the chat box. Next slide. We know child development does not occur in isolation, and that the Learn the Signs Act Early milestone checklist, we believe, can continue to support other work and efforts in early childhood. The revised resources continue to have a place within the larger early childhood landscape, and the CDC's Learn the Signs Act Early program and ambassadors hope the revisions to the checklist and expansion of the tips and activities can support other early childhood providers' work in these areas and more. Just as the milestones are one component of the milestone checklist, and those are only one component of developmental surveillance at well child visits, the Learn the Signs Act Early program is much bigger than checklists, and Stephanie is going to tell you a little bit more about that.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Jen, because that was a great overview of all the hard work that you all have been doing at the CDC over the last few years on updating these milestone checklists. And really, though, some of the work that I do as the Ohio Act Early Ambassador is my favorite. And the goal of this work is to not only get the materials into families' hands, but really build strategy across our different states. And we also have ambassadors in every state and 3 territories. And we want to advance the partnerships and integration at the state and local levels. So we work with our state teams to identify how to get these materials engaged in with the Head Start centers and the early Head Starts across the different messaging that the Part C systems are also offering. So really we want to partner with these different national organizations and promote the developmental screening and monitoring as recommended by AAP to just strengthen everyone's understanding of what a child should be doing at certain age ranges. So as I mentioned, there's 59 ambassadors. So if you don't know who yours is in your state, you can go to the website there at the bottom as there's a link and find out who that person is, connect with them. We love to hear from folks in our state because we know everyone has great ideas and great networks. And we're here to be the champions. I can tell you that it has been just a joy for my professional career to be able to do this work. And we're just passionate about this. One of the things that I got involved with this work was because I would go into the Head Start centers and I would see on the walls how folks were celebrating, oh, all children had their physicals done at the beginning of the school year, or they had their dentist appointments all checked off. But I didn't see developmental monitoring and screening being celebrated. So we really want to work to and integrate all this, just as with any physical health. We want to focus on all the different domains of development. And so as part of our partnerships, as mentioned previously, we have close partnerships with AAP, and these are really excellent materials as well. There's a clinician tip sheet around risks, strengths, and protective factors. That's fantastic. There's also a family-friendly guide around developmental concerns. And then if you're interested as well, the PediaLink courses are fantastic, and they're an hour, and they just really go into a bit more depth. And I really enjoyed the strategies for improving developmental surveillance and screening. And anybody that works in primary care or supports through any type of consultation with pediatric providers or family practice providers, it's a really great way to think about how to integrate surveillance and screening into the practice that may not already be occurring regularly. And so just as a quick recap, we've seen some really great things from the release of these updated milestones. We've talked about screening as early as possible, more quickly in identifying those delays. And as a worried parent myself, when my child was not saying words at 12 months, and I was having a huge sigh of relief that, okay, he's still on track. He's doing other communication things. I can join in that sigh of relief that we're going to continue to monitor. And now the milestones reflect what most children can do. Some of the things that we've also heard in social media, especially, is that CDC has quietly lowered the standards for child development to hide negative impacts of masking. But I think, as you heard and can understand, this was all done long before the COVID-19 pandemic. And in general, the developmental milestone around crawling and communication at 30 months has been addressed today. So most important, we're excited that people are talking about child development, and really exciting that our web pages, downloading the app and accessing the paper have increased dramatically. So especially the paper, as you can see, is in the top 5% of downloads. So it's really wonderful that people are engaged in this work and focusing on child development. And as previously mentioned, opportunities to engage with the national organizations across the board that are focused on promotion of child development. These are just a couple links that you'll be able to explore related to the Help Me Grow National Center on how they see these updated milestones improving the work of developmental promotion and monitoring. And then the 0 to 3 group as well has a wonderful link there to check out. Some just key takeaways around Learn the Signs Act early awareness. These are health communication tools, not screeners. They should not replace developmental screening. Early identification is obviously best. And we are working to support early identification, not just enrollment in Part C early intervention, but all early identification through the various partnerships, the Act Early Networks, and the Ambassador Program. Surveillance, monitoring, screening are complementary but different. And we want to engage parents as much as possible in the developmental surveillance at the well child visits. And in the larger scale, developmental delays and disabilities are common. Universal developmental screening is recommended at various ages or anytime there are concerns. And the common goal is to just get children identified early as possible. And the only other thing that I'll take a quick mention is the importance of engaging families. For example, in Ohio, we have data from the National Survey of Children with Special Healthcare Needs that only about 30% of families report that they were engaged in the screening process with their child's doctor. Do I think that only 30% of pediatricians and doctors in the state of Ohio are performing screening? No, but I think that families don't realize what is happening at those well child visits. And so we really want to encourage those conversations. And that's what Dr. Zubler talked about. Those open-ended questions are fantastic for engaging families in the process and helping them understand that they're part of the team and they're integral in supporting development in their children. So hopefully didn't leave very much time for questions, but I'm happy to stick around for a minute or two. But thank you so much for your time. There's our contact information.
Thank you, Steph. We do have a hard stop at 12, but I'm sure there are a lot of people who have questions. I see Audrey turning on the camera and ready to ask questions. If folks have 2 minutes or so to hang around, we will take maybe a couple questions, but other than that, people, are free to leave, and we will make sure to post this talk in our IDEA website. Thank you. Audrey, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So it's quick, but I think really important for a lot of us researchers here. I'm wondering if the CDC would be willing to talk about and put out there what kind of research would be helpful, because it's shocking, 34 studies on milestone development. And so really important things like, are retrospective studies okay? If you've got these skills by 18 months, that doesn't tell you when their skills are being developed. What is the best method? The app that you have is a great potential tool, right? For and setting the markers for when that milestone is actually attained, because I think that is a huge barrier to doing this research. Is it the first day you walked? Do you have to walk for 10 days? Do you have to walk across the room? Being able to set some of these criteria, I think people are looking desperately for that. So I wanted to just put that out there.
Thanks, Audrey. That gives us a lot to think about. I think in the paper we do address some of that. I think any research would be helpful at this point. Of course, prospective studies are preferred, but if there's a chance to do a retrospective study that would give us some information, that would be helpful as well. I think what's most important, 2 takeaways. One is that we need research on individual milestones. A lot of the information that's out there are on domains of development or compilation scores on domains of development. So looking at individual milestones. And then the second takeaway is that we really need a lot more research on social emotional milestones and cognitive milestones. The large majority of the published literature is on the physical or motor domain.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I'm sure, Jen, do you want to jump in too?
Well, I just want to say, I like milestones, but I am not CDC, I'm a consultant, but I'm a pediatrician, and I'm really interested in more what works in the conversation in addition to milestones. So I would love to see how to help support families in that contemplation phase of asking.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for thoughtful comments, and I'm gonna end the presentation, but I'm sure a lot of folks will reach out to you guys in emails. So thank you so much for the presentation today. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.